Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Every so often, when I'm listening to the news, I catch wind of a story that really fascinates me. Not because the content of the story is particularly interesting, but because I think the story itself says something very important about the way people consume and retell stories. If you're a longtime follower of this channel, you know that I like to talk about the story circle, which is a way of thinking about stories and how they are told and retold. An understanding of this process is an important part of what makes stories good, and seeing how many times it is played out over time is an important part of evaluating them. By its very nature, the news is designed not only to be told to people, but for them to retell it and for them to hear it over and over again. After all, most people hear headlines many times over. Over the last month or so, two stories have come up in North America that have made me really think about the importance of how we tell stories and draw people into them. They are the spy balloon story and the Ohio train derailment. For my purposes today, the factual nature of these stories is not as important as what spread and made them take over the public consciousness, because both of these stories did not begin with a big news channel or a very well-known outlet. They began at a local level. If you go back to the moment that the spy balloon began to enter the conversation in the United States, you see it primarily spread through social media, pictures, and videos that were taken by people on the ground. Then local news channels picked it up, and it very quickly spread from there. By the same token, the derailment of a train in East Palestine, Ohio, was not a national news story at first. We primarily saw it through social media posts, Twitter comments, Instagram photos, and videos on TikTok. The nation as a whole was introduced to the idea through the personal commentary of people who were on the ground, and the stakes that they were experiencing as a strange cloud began to cover their state, as their animals began to die, and as dead fish began to show up in the rivers and streams. Then the governor of Ohio started to talk about the matter, and from that point, finally, we began to hear of it on some people with nationwide pull, although you're still not seeing a whole lot of it in the news at the time of this recording. I have found several local news segments on it, which you would expect, but not a whole lot of coverage from really big news outlets, places like CNN. Okay, which is arguably not a big outlet anymore, but my point stands. News outlets that primarily target the nation as a whole have not discussed this story a great deal. What, then, is making these stories so persistent and capture the imagination of the public so much? Well, I think it is, again, the fact that we are hearing about these stories first and foremost from the point of view of specific people. People taking strange videos from their backyard porch. People taking photos as they're out hiking in the Montana mountains. These are the kinds of moments that give these stories a very real, very visceral sense of personal impact. It makes people repeat them over and over to each other, not because it's a list of facts that they heard on the news, but because it's a very specific, very personal event that you can very easily digest and relate to others. This kind of direct, personal moment is a great way to grab and hold attention and make people repeat a story. It's much easier to remember, hey, I went out on my back porch and I saw something very weird, than a series of strange events happened over Montana, or something like that. And that's very informative for anyone who wants to tell a story with a big scope. Keep in mind, the spy balloon story implicated China, the primary geopolitical rival of the United States in the modern era. That's about as big as a story can get on Earth in 2023. And yet it began with people taking weird photos in Montana, which is not, the most populated state in the nation. Even when dealing with the biggest possible events, it is far better, I think, from the audience point of view, to involve them at a very personal level without a great understanding of what is going on, than to begin at the broad level and hit people with all of the facts before dialing in on something that they will really relate to. Now, it's true that relatability can be a bit of an overdone thing in media today, and I'm not saying that every element of your story has to be relatable, but if you are looking for a hook to draw someone in, a moment with a very relatable person experiencing something big that they don't understand is a much better way to bring them in than throwing the big issue in people's faces right off the bat. The second lesson of these stories is that confusion and uncertainty is a great way to snag an audience. Now, this is a lesson that you can take from just about any headline you look at. They are designed to tell you as little as possible while exciting your curiosity as much as possible, usually through a sense of uncertainty or fear about whatever the article is talking about. Now, ideally, the news should clear up that uncertainty and trepidation as it goes on, which doesn't always happen. But when you are telling a story, that is definitely something you have to keep an eye on. How much is your reader uncertain of? How much do they want to go and figure things out? And are you confusing them without clarifying anything to the point where they become uninvested in the story? And I think the third lesson that we can take away from these events is that very intimate and personal stories that lead into something big very quickly become that big thing and very quickly become incredibly unwieldy, which is something that the author must keep in mind as they are telling these stories. In the spy balloon story, we very quickly went from a single balloon just floating over the United States being very strange to a bunch of balloons being all over North America and getting blown up before anyone really knows what's going on. And yeah, that can get kind of funny, especially when you could potentially have a $12 civilian balloon blown up by a $40,000 military missile. Or it can be shocking when you have a train car full of deadly chemicals just basically blown up and burned for no clear reason. The contrast of these very granular personal stories playing out against the backdrop of large and confusing forces grinding away at each other is part of what makes these stories so fascinating and part of why I think people keep coming back to them and telling them over and over again. This contrast is very stark and very memorable, and it's part of what makes these stories so powerful. There's nothing wrong with selecting one side of this equation or the other to focus on, but I think if you do that, your appeal to a broad audience that wants to tell and retell your story is going to decrease. So there you have it. 3 quick thoughts from the headlines that I think are really very useful for anyone looking to tell stories about big and world-shaping events. A relatable hook, a carefully balanced amount of uncertainty, and the contrast of the personal and the monumental. Master these 3 things, and I think you will find that whatever story you want to tell on whatever scale and scope will easily fit inside of your story circle. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.